topic is fascinating, and we're absolutely delighted to have one of the nation's really foremost authorities on this with us tonight. Professor Lampton, now Professor Emeritus from Johns Hopkins, has his degrees from Stanford, Phi Beta Kappa as an undergrad, going through MA and then PhD. And he's had a remarkable set of positions. He's been in charge of China studies at the American Enterprise Institute, the Nixon institution, or whatever that may not be the right combination of words there, but in any case, and then also being in charge of China studies at SAIS. He's published in all of the major journals and serious scholarly publications. He's been recognized by the Russians for his work in the Asian area, by the Chinese as well. So he enjoys a reputation which is of respect, which is truly international. The list of awards are many. His civic contributions parallel his academic contributions. Just parenthetically and incidentally, he was dean of faculty for a while at 8 years or so at SAIS. He's headed up the U.S. Committee on U.S.-China Relations. But his academic work has been so thorough in terms of a broad coverage of China. Certainly the domestic affairs. He's looked hard at all the regimes since Mao. He's deeply aware of everything that goes on internally, almost everything, within China. And he's written on U.S. interests in China, of course. We couldn't have a more prepared and respected guest than Mike Lampton. It's my great pleasure to present him.
Well, good evening, and can everybody hear me? If my voice drops off, my great fear in life is not reaching the back row. So if somehow my voice trails off or I get disoriented from the mic, just wave or give me some hand gesture, hopefully friendly, and I'll raise the volume. So in any case, it's good. I was just thinking that Frank and I have known each other, I'm just saying, 20 years, and I've made several opportunities to come and speak with you, and I always immediately accept because it's such an engaged, interested, and knowledgeable audience. So I'm going to try to allocate at least approximately 40 or 50% of the talk to back and forth, because the relationship between China and the United States, indeed China's relations with the world, are becoming increasingly complex. I guess you could have put the sentence the other way and said America's relations with the rest of the world are becoming more complex too. But when you put those both together, maybe we can sort of see where things are headed. I've been asked to talk this evening about the U.S. and China and the movement from what we might call strategic engagement with China to strategic competition with China. And I should just have a little truth in advertising. I, of course, came of, let's say, age and intellectual interest during the Vietnam War. And of course, my uncle had been involved in the Korean War. And so I came, when I was picking a career and was at Stanford, thought that, the two big wars of the Cold War really involved China, in the case of Korea, directly, and Vietnam actually directly as well, but also as a kind of proxy war. And so the big problematic for me and the big challenge I set for myself was to marginally put my hand on the side of mutual understanding and peace. Because that was the big destabilizing relationship beyond, of course, the Soviet Union, with which China was allied. And so when I start this evening's speech, and it's going to have a lot of the problems, we're not living in the world I spent my career working for. I'm not celebrating what I'm trying to analyze. I've been an optimist my entire career. I think we need to get through what may be a rather long, uncomfortable period, but it's very important that we do, because the costs of not managing this relationship as best it can be managed, and it's not entirely within our control, those costs are very great. So this is a different talk than I've given in the preceding appearances here, I believe, because the situation has changed. Now, it's changed over time and incrementally, so it didn't all happen with the election of Mr. Trump or Mr. Xi Jinping. There have been antecedents, but I think things have deteriorated substantially, and the real question is how, if it can be, can this relationship be productively managed? Now, I think the first thing I'd really like to do, well, what I'd like to do is organize this around my observation this morning as I was thinking about the talk. Look at the front page of the Washington Post if you have the opportunity. And of course, Frank, you made reference to the other activities that are going on as we speak, so there's a lot of competition for page space in the Washington Post. The upper left-hand corner this morning was about China meddling, that was the president's characterization, our president's characterization, in the politics of the United States, in particular the upcoming election. And then you go through the paper, and there were other mentions of China, but then you get to the opinion page, and there is a longtime reporter, very well thought of, written an excellent book on U.S.-China relations, a man named John Pomfret, and he ends his article by saying we really have to radically rethink our policy towards China. So in this day when we're so preoccupied with other things, you can't even squeeze China out of the bad news on a high news day about other things. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Now, if you ask basically what's going on in U.S.-China relations, just kind of create a kind of image, I think now in both of our societies, domestic politics is driving our foreign policy to an almost unprecedented extent. Now, we could argue about the 1950s, but we are in a position, and particularly China's in a position, where to understand their behavior in the world, I think you need to understand what's going on there. And of course, I think if you look at our State Department and our bureaucracy and our Congress, understanding our domestic politics here is pretty important. And basically the storyline in American politics, sort of thinking strategically, is that for the last 40 years, the United States engaged China. We, through our scientific exchange, through our economic relationships, through our technological transfer to China, we have in fact created a rival power that now threatens our dominance. I think that's kind of the storyline here. But there's a storyline in China. And the storyline in China is that the people who wanted to accommodate the United States during this long period didn't realize that China's power was growing, that China had more capabilities, that China had more interests, and indeed the United States at the bottom of its policies always trying to change China to be more politically agreeable to Western values. And that the Chinese people no longer have to put up with a secondary position to the United States. And it's some version of that. So what we have is sort of a nationalism and populism driving but the analysis of really the last 40 years. And that's, I think, a pretty toxic kind of analysis that's sort of at the bottom of how people are reacting. So against that kind of description of the overall situation, what I want to do is talk about four things quickly and then leave plenty of time for questions. And what I'd like to talk to first is that I think it's very important to understand why did the United States and why did 8 administrations adopt an engagement policy? Why did we ever go down that road? And of course, there are a lot of people that weren't even alive when Richard Nixon went to China. So I think it's worth talking for a minute. Why did the United States and why did 8 administrations pursue an engagement policy? Were they all wrong? Were they all mistaken? So I think that's worth thinking about. Secondly, we're not talking very much. We're talking about all the perceived losses that we suffered at the hands of engagement, whether it's trade deficit, and I'll go through all of that. But we're talking a lot about the presumed losses. But what I want to do is remind people what engagement actually produced for both societies. It's a mixed balance sheet, but it's certainly not all to be ignored what was some of the gains. Then I'd thirdly like to talk, all that aside, the consensus on continuing engagement is gone. Whether it was a great idea or misapplied, or it was a great idea to start, but it deteriorated over time. The fact is the consensus on productive engagement with China is pretty weak, if not almost entirely gone. And there's the parallel process in China. So I want to talk a little about that, and then I want to wind up, because I always say, you have an obligation. You can't just describe a problem. You got to at least begin to point people in, well, how can we at least, if not reverse the course, how can we slow the descent, or how can we make it less hurtful to both societies? So that's what I'd really like to talk about, and then we'll throw it open, and there are just so many dimensions in which we could talk about that it's better that I direct my attention to what you're interested in than what I presume you might be interested in. So why did Richard Nixon, the ultimate anti-communist realist, why did he and his successors want to engage with China? And we've always, up until recently, defined a growing, prosperous China is in the interests of the United States. 7 presidents said some version of that sentence continuously. Now, first reason we did it is we were in a quagmire. If you think about the Cold War and the wars of Vietnam and Korea, they were around China. They were on the periphery of China. They had something to do with China. In the case of Korea, we lost about 50-some thousand soldiers there. The Chinese lost probably 1 million, and the North Koreans and the South Koreans an enormous number. In Vietnam, we all know that story. Well, Richard Nixon wanted to go to China to improve relations with China in the hope that A, we wouldn't have a strategic threat that kept sucking us into quagmires around it. And secondly, he thought the Chinese would use their influence to get North Vietnam to cut a deal with the Americans. So Richard Nixon really went to China. He always talked about the generation of peace. And he was serious about that. And he was pragmatic enough to think, I've got to go to the source of the problem, reach an understanding. And of course, we did get out in the mid-70s out of Vietnam, although I'll be honest, the Chinese didn't help very much in extracting us from Vietnam. So I think he was a little misplaced in how much the Chinese were going to help. But on the other hand, that was certainly his motivation. And if you think about the 2 wars in 1950s and then the 60s and the 70s, after normalization and after Nixon went, we had no wars with the Chinese. So engagement, first of all, brought us 40 years of peace. Now, not alone, but that was an important component. And how many foreign policies, incidentally, last 40 years? That's the first thing. And so, in any case, I think, he went there for that reason. He also went there to exert pressure on the Soviet Union on the arms control front. And we could talk more about that if you wish, but that was relatively successful at that period. Now, there's a lot of debate about the strategic arms limitation talks and ABM talks and all of these. It wasn't a thorough success, but indeed we did reach agreements that at least capped the expansion of nuclear weapons with the Soviet Union. When President Carter came along, he had many motivations, personal, and Carter's an interesting story on China. But one of the reasons that he wanted to go was essentially economic. That was, in fact, his Treasury Secretary. Some of you may remember Michael Blumenthal. He had fled Europe as the Nazis took over. A Jewish person ended up, like many Jewish people, in Shanghai. And so when Carter came in and Blumenthal's background in American industry and so forth, wanted to help China develop with this really quite self-interested notion that if China develops, we'll get a new market and it will be in our economic interests. Then you get to, George W. Bush. We skip a few presidents here. But then we had the sense that we could cooperate with China on anti-terrorism. And we developed a number of things with China in the anti-terrorist intelligence sharing. Something was called the Container Security Initiative, as China was such a big shipper of goods into American ports like Baltimore and so on. We wanted to enhance the security of shipments coming into the United States in the wake of 9/11. Now, there have been some problems, but the Chinese did have us in, I guess the FBI was in Shanghai and other ports looking at cargoes coming to the United States and so on. And then, when you get to Barack Obama, certainly all of those kinds of incentives for normalization or for good relations with China existed. But he also became more concerned about global issues like climate change, international health issues, and so forth. So what I'm trying to say is we, all through all these administrations, the rationale and the balance among strategic and economic and cultural, the specific rationale kind of changed and evolved over time. But the point is that we always wanted to pursue productive relations with China because we could see important interests that we had that would be pursued by doing so. Now, the Chinese didn't always live up to our expectations. Sometimes they signed agreements that, let's put it gently, they didn't always observe. But on the other hand, each of these 7 administrations before the current one made the judgment that it was better to cooperate than not. If that was the choice, at least try to cooperate as broadly as you can, and so forth. Now you got to ask, why were the Chinese in this? So all I'm trying to say is there was a rationale. That rationale changed a bit over time, but 7 administrations in a row made a judgment that on balance we were better off. Now, what was in it for China? Well, if you think back to the 1960s and particularly early 1970s, once Nixon came in, what was the world like for China? And the world for China was the Americans were hostile down in Vietnam and an alliance with Japan and a global strategy opposed to the communists. And also China had the Soviet Union as a strategic threat, actually contemplating attacking China directly, strategically. So Mao basically made the calculation, my big, poor country cannot afford having 2 strategic superpowers, both hostile. So which one is less of a problem for me? And the Americans were less of a problem for Mao than was the Soviet Union. And so he moved towards an anti-communist Richard Nixon. It was a really improbable event. If you just looked at each person's resume, so to speak, you wouldn't have figured they would find strategic common interest. Then Deng Xiaoping comes along after Mao moves towards the United States, and he says, my country, China, is poorer on a per capita basis than Cambodia. Poorer than Cambodia. I remember talking to Deng Xiaoping's one of his daughters, and she says, I asked, why did your father want to move for economic reform? And she said, that's simple. China, its name means Zhongguo, the Middle Kingdom. We're supposed to be the leader, the economic, we're the big intrinsic power. And all of the countries and areas, Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, every last one of them's in better shape than we are. We got to do something about that. And who has the capital? Who has the technology? Who has the education? Who can we learn from? The answer was the United States. And he just took Mao's opening and swung the door wide open. Why else did China move towards the United States? Because the United States was the gatekeeper to every significant international organization on the face of the earth, practically. You're not getting into the World Bank unless the U.S. approves it, and he wanted in the World Bank. So the point is the Chinese had their reasons. Very big reason is China went through the Cultural Revolution and destroyed for a decade its institutions of education, in particular higher education. And so you come along, and in 1978, you have now Jimmy Carter there, and you have obviously Deng Xiaoping, and he essentially worked out with Frank Press, the science advisor to the president at that time, that we would open our doors to Chinese as long as they could pay the tuition to come or get financial support. With the Soviets, we always traded person for person. You get a physicist at Harvard, and we get one at Moscow University. Well, you couldn't move many people when you were negotiate the relationship one by one. China, we basically opened the doors to American education to the point now there are 350,000 Chinese in American higher education institutions, and frankly, I don't know how many in private, secondary and even primary schools. But the point is, we lifted China's wrecked educational system up. We were the sort of the high-octane gas that was poured into a pretty empty tank. So the point is, I'm just really trying to say, is that we both had very important reasons to move towards each other, and it lasted roughly for 40 years. Now, I want to talk a little about, what you would think are some of the gains, or put it this way, what were some of the consequences of this? This massive movement towards each other in economic, military, and educational and cultural. What were some of the results? And I think we have to be of course, things sometimes look different in retrospect than they did at the time. And there are many unanticipated consequences. So I don't mean to say every outcome of this massive movement was positive in retrospect. But let me just tick off some of the dimensions of what has happened, I believe, because of this movement towards each other that was self-interested on the part of both countries. First of all, when we started this, China had roughly 2% of global GDP. And China's population was 25% of the world's people, and they had 2% of the GDP. Well, as I said, China was poorer per capita than Cambodia. And the United States at that time, depending on how you calculate all these things, but was roughly 35%, and we were 4% of the world's people, which is to say 4% of the world's people had 1/3 of the output, and the Chinese that were 25% of the world's people had 2% of the output. Well, what's the situation now? Now, the figures you'll hear, but the trend line's undeniable. We can argue over a few percentage points. But roughly now, China's at 17% of global GDP, and the U.S. is at 15. Now, you can say China's at 17%, but it's 20% of the world's people. So it's not even to its share of GDP per capita if you were to assume everybody ought to be equal, which, of course, is a pretty faulty assumption. But the point is, China isn't at even its percentage of GDP of its population. Now, it'll get there quickly unless there's a catastrophe of some sort. And the U.S., we're at, what, 15 to 16, something like that. We're still 4 times per capita wise. So, and it's not that the U.S. has gotten absolutely poor, but it's that relative economic power in the world has shifted. Now, we can argue, would China have grown so rapidly without engagement? And I think the answer is undeniably China grew much more rapidly because the U.S. cooperated by opening markets, opening its institutions of higher education, selling at modern technology except in a few sensitive areas and so forth. On the other hand, it would be, I think, foolhardy to say the only reason China grew is because the U.S. was cooperative. I think the Chinese are smart and entrepreneurial people, and they save, 40 to 50% of their income. So people who save high, value education, and work like crazy, they're going to succeed. So I don't delude myself we could have slowed China down a lot, but I think we were really pretty cooperative on balance for a dominant power seeing its relative position erode a bit by a bit. So that's one of the outcomes. You can say that's a good outcome, that's a bad outcome, but one of the results was 500 million people or more were lifted out of absolute poverty. You got to say, at least in the humanitarian sense, that's a big plus. As I've mentioned, we had 40 years without war, and it wasn't all because of engagement, but as foreign policy goes, I think it was related to some of that outcome. If you think about money, now a lot of people worry that China has bought a lot of U.S. bonds and treasury instruments, and I make it clear I am worried about U.S. debt levels, so I'm not unconcerned about that. But the fact of the matter is that poor China is now loaning us $1.6 trillion. And if you want to wonder why your interest rates have been low as they've been for a long time, you want to know why the U.S. is able to spend way above its means, the answer is in part because the Chinese have been willing to loan us a whole lot of money for very good reasons. This is a big liquid market, and it's pretty safe as things go for China. So China's doing it for its own interest. But the point is, we've enjoyed a lot of economic growth by virtue of low interest rates that probably wouldn't have been there. Now, like everything else, on the other hand, China's loaned us $1.6 trillion, and that means they have some influence in our policy just by virtue of the desire we would have to continue access to those kinds of funds. Certainly, I think another big result, as I've mentioned, is the educational student exchange. Now, once again, this is one of those two-sided coins. American universities are enormous sources of technology, and we, bless our hearts, we recruit the best brains in the world, and then we expose them to what we have, and they sometimes stay here and help us, and sometimes they go back home, sometimes they go to a third country, any number of things. But the long and the short of it is that those Chinese students now pay about $13 billion in tuition to American institutions. That is about the same size as America's Boeing aircraft exports to China and soybean exports from the entire farming community of the United States. So education, spent my whole life in education. I don't want to boil it down to who pays tuition, but let's put it this way. This is a big export industry for the United States, and China's by far the biggest contributor or purchaser of our educational exports. Now, once again, and the U.S. government, and I'm not even criticizing it, I'm describing it, is concerned about the technology transfer that comes out of labs and inventions and so forth. Just to show you how complicated it is, though, many of those students that graduate then go out to Silicon Valley and build firms and startups, and sometimes they build relations back home, meaning back in China, and so forth. So everything's got its pluses and minuses there. So the long and the short of it is this relationship has produced huge changes. All of them are sort of, they have their, I suppose from a national interest point of view, the good points, the bad points. But the point is both sides were operating through this last 4 decades trying to understand what their interests were and saw more positive to this relationship than negative. So the problem was always, how can we downplay the positive or the negative? How can we reduce the problems? And how can we expand the benefits? Well, you know, the calculus has now changed. We're really more in now to reducing damage than maximizing gain. I think that's kind of the, and true in China as well as here. Now, before I go on to talking about how's this being reflected, let me just, a couple of examples, because I think we're really in danger of forgetting how important it is that the strongest 4% of the world's people cooperate with the second strongest 20% of the world's people. And I just want to give you 3 examples of what cooperation can mean. When I was a young man just starting, I went to the National Academy of Sciences and ran a program called the Science, Technology, and Industry Program for the National Academy of Sciences in China. And our first program was called, it was an elegant title for a program, the Post-Harvest Loss Reduction Report on Fruits and Vegetables. So anyway, it was trying to take into account that in China, at that time, 1985, China lost about 50% of the fruit and vegetables between the time it was picked and the time it got to the dinner table. So if you were worried, as you should have been in 1985, about the nutrition of the Chinese people, you didn't have to bring any more land into cultivation. You didn't have to dump any more fertilizer to get a big increase in effective food consumption just by reducing loss from when it's picked to when it gets to the consumer's table. And how do you do that? You do this towards better, more spoilage-resistant plants and technology and seed development, aseptic packaging, where you package things and you don't have to have refrigeration, but it still stays usable. You did it through how you process things, transport, cold storage, wholesaling systems. Well, China now has a loss rate of about, depends on the crop and the year, but basically 10 to 20%. So, and the U.S., not only the U.S. government and the Academy of Sciences and the Agriculture Department and U.S. industry, we cooperated with Chinese industry and government to reduce that loss, and there were others involved too, not just the U.S., but now it's about 10 or 20%. That's still a lot, but the point is that's like a 30% increase without any of the big inputs that might be required. That's a huge achievement, and it was through cooperation and self-interest that we did it. Another example, which I've always been grateful for, because I fly in China a lot, and when you flew in China in 1970s and 80s, just to make not too fine a point, you were taking your life in your hands. It was one of the most unsafe air systems in the world. And the Federal Aviation Administration and Boeing Corporation, for the obvious reason it wanted to sell aircraft, and actually Airbus as well helped, we cooperated with the Chinese literally to sell them and buy them and install them and train them in air traffic management. And their safety record now is as good as or better than the United States. Now, that's a global good because so many people flying in China. Not to mention, you couldn't sell all the Boeing aircraft we're selling if you didn't have traffic management so that you could fly that many planes simultaneously. Cooperation. Now, of course, somebody will say, well, you also increase the capacity of the Chinese military to manage space. I guess that's true. It's the nature of, I guess, development. It empowers you to lots of different people to do things. Just one other example. China, because it's earned so much foreign exchange, has now become an investor in the world. And it was until 2017 that picture changes, but China is rapidly increasing its foreign investment abroad. And of course, we all remember Detroit, and it went bankrupt, if I recall, in 2013. There are now way over 100 Chinese investment auto part plants in the greater Detroit area. And, it's a source of employment. I don't want to exaggerate, but China's brought in at least 1,000 jobs additional, and also kept plants open that might not have stayed open had the U.S. auto industry completely tanked. The GM now sells more cars in China than the United States. And I remember not too many years ago when I was a young man, went to Detroit to GM headquarters. I mean, that was like the temple of modern capitalism, right? And so it wasn't really government bailouts that saved GM. It was the China market. So just think broadly. So when we toss out the window and get into a kind of conflict-oriented frame of mind, remember there's a lot that's happened here. It's all got its pluses and minuses, but you can do your own calculus. Now, having said all that, and it's been a long wind-up by saying, there was a reason we normalized, and it produced a lot of positives, but nonetheless, as I started out, the consensus on continuing such an open approach, and incidentally, I think we have to change our policy. So I'm not arguing, let's do the last 40 years for the next 40 years. I don't think that's feasible. But the consensus has been broken, and I just want to paint the picture of what's going on. I don't, as I say, don't celebrate this. I also don't entirely know what to do about it. So, but I think the first thing is you got to describe the problem. And it seems to me the first thing is, there's no particular order here, but just the range of problems now we're facing in U.S.-China relations. And I'm putting this one, which might not normally occur to you first because actually I think it's the most dangerous. I could be wrong in that assessment, but that's sort of what I think. And that's the Taiwan issue. When Nixon went to China, the big issue was Taiwan. It's always been, to a higher or a lower degree, an item on our agenda. But really, until about 2016, this issue was being managed pretty well by people in Taiwan and China, and we did the right things, but we weren't too involved, and that was just what we should have wanted to be. But in the last couple of years now, China has become more worried that Taiwan has a domestic political party that is heading towards independence. They are more worried that as their relationship with us goes south, that we will see Taiwan as a useful lever on them. Just earlier this week, we sold agreed to sell $333, I believe it was $333 million in weapons to Taiwan, which drives China to distraction. But the long and the short of it is China's putting more pressure, military and economic and diplomatic, on Taiwan. And it's feeding all our impulses to support Taiwan in the face of a big communist, increasingly illiberal China. And so I'm really quite worried about that. And Congress, I guess it was in February or March, passed the Taiwan Travel Act. That's a complicated story, but it's a piece of legislation the Chinese are extremely worried about. And if President Trump acts on its it's a sense of Congress resolution, so he doesn't have to do what it asks him to do. But in any event, we could end up in the soup with Taiwan, I think, more rapidly than a lot of people realize. We can talk more about that, but that's one area. Certainly, another area is as China has felt its relationship with us weaken, its move towards Russia. Remember, Nixon went to China to oppose the Soviet Union. Now China's going to Russia to get friends in its increasing conflict or friction with the United States. And just about a few weeks back, China and Russia had the biggest joint exercises they've ever had in their history. I think it was over 330,000 people. I think the Russians were like 300,000 and the Chinese were 30, so it wasn't 150,000 each or so. But in any case, that's a bad sign. And I'll come back to that point. But if you think just keep in mind that the policy of the United States has always been we should never create a circumstance where Eurasia and the Pacific is under the hostile coalition or under the domination of any hostile power. And we are pushing Russia and China together. So you got to ask, is that something we want to be doing? If you look at military budgets now, China kicked up this year. China's got a big building program on aircraft carriers, on space vehicles. It has a big space program. It's already planning to go to the moon and on to Mars. We're seeing the creation of weapon systems for space and so forth. And incidentally, the United States is responding, so don't think we're just sitting on our hands. Of course, we've had the biggest increase in the military budget in a long time here. We had the sequestration and sort of almost mandated long-term decline of the military expenditure, but now our budget is going up rather dramatically. Certainly another whole area is that, as I mentioned with the Washington Post, front page, upper left-hand corner, the president is now accusing China of destabilizing our politics. Now, he didn't, in his comment, exactly explain what he meant, but what I believe he means, and he can certainly explain himself, but I believe what he means is that because we're now in this tariff war, the Chinese have targeted products of key Republicans, to put it bluntly, whether it's Senator McConnell and bourbon from Kentucky, or it's soybeans from the farm states. The Chinese have done their homework, and they know what senators and congressmen represent what districts with what economic basis, and they're going after it very systematically. Now, of course, we're inflicting tariffs on China with the idea we're going to weaken Xi Jinping, right? So whether you want to call this interference in the internal affairs or just how international politics is waged, that we can talk about that. But I think that's what he has in mind. He can speak for himself, but I'm unaware of it being like the Russians trying to actually get into our voting system, but maybe somebody will disabuse me of that. Certainly another whole area that's obvious is this mounting tariff war. And we are rapidly reaching the point where neither side has any more goods it can slap a tariff on. Now, it could take the goods and start raising the percentage, but we are now, both of us, running out of things to tariff, at least at some level, very rapidly. And I can guarantee you, because I was over, I guess it was in about 4 months ago, talking to Chinese leaders, and they are not going to quit. Now, that, of course, they were trying to convince me that was true. They convinced me. Now, maybe I'll turn out and they're going to fold their hand tomorrow morning and we'll all say hallelujah, but I don't think so. First of all, what can they go after? Well, first of all, they can, what's called phytosanitary standards. One of our whole big exports to China is agricultural goods. they can just get slow on making sure there isn't any fungus or blight on our agricultural exports. And the longer they float offshore in container ships, the greater your loss. And so you can, regulations. How long does it take to get a license to do business? What if they start having fire inspections in all of the plants? I mean, there's a million ways they can go after you. But the way that we're not even talking about is probably one of the most important. China, when we talk about Chinese exports to the United States and the trade balance deficit, which is huge as we calculate it, American companies in China, producing in China, directly export to China at least $233 billion in goods. And by many estimates, it's higher than that. So what I'm trying to say is many American exports don't enter the trade mechanism. They're sold directly to China, and China will go after those. So I think they will. They are. And now, so who has the greatest threshold for pain? A democracy coming up on an election? Well, it's always got elections. And, you know, an authoritarian government. I think authoritarian governments can inflict a lot of pain on their people, right? So anyway, I think I'm not saying we're destined to lose, but I'm saying this isn't ending anytime soon unless we get a little flexible here on both sides. Another thing that's happened is, and this will sound, my father would have said corny. This will sound corny. But, you know, the United States had great influence in China for those 40 years in a sense that we were generally seen as a well-governed society. Now, that doesn't mean, but right now the Chinese are sort of asking, they started with the global financial crisis. They say, here you through your lack of regulation and property and all of the things that went wrong in the global financial crisis, you created a global infection that's affected everybody. You're not managing your internal affairs well. And this has just become, so it was long before Trump they were heading in this direction. But China itself isn't doing what it was doing for the previous 40 years in terms of its own internal governance. China is now becoming a much more authoritarian surveillance state. Some of the unhappiest people I know are intellectuals in China as this is going on. So what I'm trying to say is both of us are not governing in ourselves in ways that are reassuring. Whether we were mistaken or not during the 40 years of engagement, most people saw China as making gradual improvement. June 4th, 1989, not so. There was back and forth. But, you know, China was heading in a better direction than a worse direction. Most people looking at China's internal governance now don't come to that conclusion. So it's one thing to have an open kind of generous spirit, so to speak, when people are struggling with big problems to go in a direction you think's okay or even desirable. It's another thing when you've reached a kind of conclusion that's not where we're headed here. So what I'm just trying to say is we had reasons to do it. We had big successes. It created some problems. Consensus is broken down for good reasons. But what can we do to think about, how should we think then about what we do in this circumstance? And I guess I sort of think the fundamental solution is we both need to get on better, that we both have to, in our own ways, straighten out our own internal situation. Otherwise, it's just Band-Aids all the way around. So I think China needs really a second reform, including political. I don't mean democratic tomorrow and elections and all of that. But I think China's got to get back on the track of greater space for the individual, more rights. The sort of orientation. The United States, I think, has to get back on its track, on our historic track. and economic policy, getting debt under control, lots of things. So the big solution here is to us to begin to pursue our better angels in each country. But that's probably not going to happen anytime soon. So what might we do in thinking about the relationship? And I'll just tick off a couple of things and then we'll get to Q&A. First of all, there's an impulse now in many quarters in Washington to fiddle with the one China policy, and if we want to, in Q&A, go into that. But that's kept, really, since Nixon went to China, various versions of the one China policy have sort of kept us out of the soup with China. And you can argue maybe it's not fair to Taiwan, lots of things to be said about that. But in the end, if one messes with the one China policy, you're going to have big problems. You just almost have to make a decision about that. And so I'd be real careful, then the you being the Congress and the administration. Now, China, with respect to Taiwan, I think has to call the dogs off in all the ways that it's putting pressure on Taiwan, both militarily, economically, and diplomatically. So but both sides need to back off the Taiwan thing, in my view. Second thing that we really need to have China do is, when all is said and done, the economic and other aspects of our relationship are not equal. Now, what does it mean equal when you're 4% of the world's people versus 20? That's an interesting question. But the long and the short of it is the relationship is not reciprocal in the ways it should be. I mean, if Chinese scholars can get 10-year visas to come to the United States, then American scholars ought to get 10-year visas to China. Now, it's a self-interested example. In the trade area, you know, if China can freely invest in American auto or plants and facilities and buy research firms in the United States, then we ought to have access to buy equivalent kinds of enterprises in China. And that doesn't exist. Not fair. It's not fair that China can have free access to the research apparatus of the United States, you know, the United States really is not allowed to even buy into equivalent enterprises and research undertakings in China. So a heavy lift for China is you have succeeded. You are climbing up global GDP. You cannot have all the special privileges and the U.S. sort of turning the other cheek because of some sense that, well, when you get richer, we'll become more equal. You're there, or you're at least getting there, and you need to treat us equally. I think what equal is, that can be discussed, but not the principle. And so I think we got to do that. And then I would say for us, we got to quit being counterproductive. I mean, why on earth would we drive Russia and China together? We can argue they're each problems in their own way. I don't think they're the same problem, but it's certainly not in our interest to have China and Russia cooperating against us. Now, how we do that, but I'm pretty sure we don't do it by having a national security strategy that came out in December of last year and a national defense strategy in January that lump China and Russia together as the two big power problems. We are treating them as a unity. Our wise, I think, diplomacy of the past said, you know, China and Russia have almost as many contradictions between them as they do with us, maybe even more. So we ought to be trying where we can not to drive them together. I don't mean to have a conscious policy of creating conflict between them, but we surely shouldn't be trying to drive them together. We ought to recognize there are different countries with different interests, and we should, for our own interest, I hate to use the word exploit those differences, but we surely shouldn't help them pave over their own contradictions. So, in the end, I am an optimist because I think we will somehow find our better angels. but it could take an awful long time. And I don't know what the time horizon is, but maybe what we got to all try to do is let's make the situation better than it would otherwise be. Thanks so much. The question is, do people like me, China experts so-called, do we have any influence in the government? And I can't speak my whole field, but I can report that the people I know who are like me, the phone is very quiet from any area code that has DOD or State Department or White House. And of course, the last thing on earth people like me like to do is say that, right? So it must be true if I'm saying it. The previous 7 administrations kind of went up and down, and incidentally, different departments of the government seek more or less advice. And over time, I've always been impressed with the Department of the Treasury. Treasury is an information data-based institution. So they ask for a lot. And they're dealing with economic issues and trade issues and so forth, so they're not less, but they're a little more technocratic in their character. But the White House historically has also been the National Security Council structure, a big consumer. And, you know, I don't know what I don't know, but it seems, from my perspective, not to be casting the net as widely outside the government right now. Partly, well, and much of the government, there aren't people in positions to be asking for advice. So, but I would say, but I mean, the whole ethos of populism is, what do experts know, right? I mean, in a way. I mean, the critique was, you guys got us into 4 decades of engagement, and now look where we are. Okay, so the question is Taiwan more or less important than the South China Sea artificial islands that the Chinese have built and put military assets on, right?
Exactly. With the construction of a military base in Djibouti as well.
Well, let's, they're both different, but I think I'd have the same answer. Taiwan is infinitely more important than all of that because of the centrality to the Chinese revolution of reunifying the country and the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. I've had Chinese leaders from Li Peng and Jiang Zemin on down tell me, if we are seen to lose Taiwan, we will be overthrown. Now, you could say, once again, they picked a credible argument that persuaded me, but after 40 years of going to China, I'm pretty convinced that's pretty much what they think. The South China Sea is really, I don't mean to say it's unimportant, and there are resources and fisheries and lots of things. So I'm not saying it's unimportant, but it's not so central to China's sense of itself, and therefore it's less volatile. Well, okay, I'll get to you in a minute. But the other reason I think the South China Sea islands are less important is they're fixed small places. They can be destroyed in a flash. So they're very vulnerable. Now, there's one other aspect, is that are others in the area intimidated by all of this? And it depends on the country. In Southeast Asia, you got big ones and little ones. But you've basically got a lot of countries there, like Thailand and so forth. They're not necessarily happy with the Chinese point of view, but they can live with it. So, and on the other hand, I don't think the U.S. Navy believes at this point that it has to ask China's permission to go through the South China Sea, and I cannot foresee the day when that would be.
Let me once more thank Professor Lampton for another wonderful evening.